let's start the recording, Walid, please, and I'll jumping right to the agenda of the webinar today, as usual, and specifically for new joiners or participants who don't know Green RWA. I will give a 5 minutes update on who we are, what we do, and then we'll jump in the main topic managed by Julien on hydrogen, myth and reality, between myth and reality. About 30 minutes of presentation there before we have a Q&A session for 15 minutes. So we'll wrap this up in about 15 minutes. So let me move on. So Green RWA, for new joiners again, it's a non-profit which aims at supporting banks in their net zero transition path by providing a specific risk framework to properly estimate the climate risk of their loan book. So it's really about estimating the climate risk of a loan book of a bank with the expectation that it will help financing more of the technology we need, for instance, to achieve effectively this net zero pathway. Our quantitative model is called the CERM, Climate Extended Risk Model. So this is the one we're publicizing on a day-to-day basis. As an association, we're now heading to about 100 members, and we're boosting our presence this year in the US with a new joiner in the team, Nicolo Surati, based in Washington, D.C., and who will help us extend our footprint in these major participants to the transition, of course. Just to give you an idea of the kind of contacts we have and we're working on, we had meetings with most of the regulators in the latest month to propose our ideas in monitoring the climate-related financial risk. Our next goal is to present at the Bank of England conference in October this year, and we're submitting a white paper in June for that matter. We're also very active in building a risk simulation sandbox on the CERM model that will be accessible to our member base with Andrews and her company IGAG leading that stream. We're targeting this summer for delivering this simulation tool on our platform. Back to climate for a second, and for those who were there in the last webinar, you might have seen these slides, but they are so important that I thought it would be a good idea to come back to that for a minute. The news from the latest IPCC report are not good. We're emitting today about 36 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So if you do the math, it's going to be extremely difficult to keep total emissions under 500 gigatons CO2 in 2050, which is the number relating to the 1.5 degrees increase target of the net zero plan. We are now heading to a 3-degree increase from here to the end of the century, according to the IPCC, if we don't change our trend and if we don't change the investments and the behavior immediately. Moreover, because of the economic crisis and the war in Ukraine, we see some changes in the behavior of the shareholders. And in US, under the pressure of the economy, the mood has bounced back. BlackRock yesterday announced that they would not support climate resolution that go against their shareholders' interest. So they are still supporting the net transition plan, but on the short term, there is a bit of a backfire here on the climate fight. This brings us to the main topic of today. As you know, in Green RWA, or as you should know, I can say, we believe innovation has a major role in the energy transition, and we see our mission is also to include, to make the connection between finance and economy, and finance and technology, for that matter. Regarding hydrogen, it's very important to notice that the International Energy Agency sees a need for $1.2 trillion investment from here to 2030, specifically to get electrolysis cost to $400 per kilowatt and avoid about 600 gigatons of CO2 emission over 2020 to 2050, which is circa 10% of the total emission, if you remember the number above of 500 gigaton of emission to limit to 500 gigaton of emission to get to 1.5 degree increase. So the question now is, why do we need that capacity of storage? Because hydrogen is a storage technology more than anything. And which sectors will be the best users of this capacity? And we have today with us Julien Deleuze, a partner at Estin, which is a strategy consulting company, and he's going to give us his view on the potential of hydrogen. Julien, the floor is yours. And the PowerPoint too. You need to unmute.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to sharing with you today. Let me share my screen to be able to show some slides. So yes, again, I'm very pleased to be talking today and discussing with you regarding the opportunity that hydrogen represents. But first, a few words, if you allow me, of presentations. I'd like to introduce the company I work for, Estin Co. We are a boutique strategy consulting firm. We work for corporation, financial institutions, and we help them define their strategy and analyze their investments. We pretty much follow quantitative and fact-based approaches, and our offices are based in Paris, in London, where I am at the moment, in Zurich, in New York, and in Shanghai. As for myself, I have been working in strategy consulting for many years, and I do have a focus, I would say, in energy, particularly in power, in climate change, and in different transverse sectors that are all impacted one way or another by energy, climate change issues. So sectors such as agribusiness, industry, construction, mobility, because pretty much all sectors are impacted by those questions. So for hydrogen, that's the key topic of the discussion today, between myth and reality. I need to articulate the reasoning and the discussion with you into 3 steps. First of all, I'd like to introduce some context and the low carbon necessity as the initial framework. Number 2 is what's the potential role for hydrogen in that context. And finally, a bit of perspective in terms of, let's say, preliminary conclusions. So as a reminder, let's recognize that so far our economies strongly rely on energy supply. So on this graph, each point represents a particular year between 1966 and 2020. So what can we see? Clearly, there's a correlation between economic growth at global level and primary energy supply. And therefore, so energy, the supply of energy is key to our economies. The problem, so what is the mix of the primary energy over the past decades, as we see on that one? The mix has been based more than 80% on fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, so the red, blue, and orange big parts of this graph. and the low carbon sources of energy. So hydraulic in light blue, nuclear in purple, the renewables with wind, solar, and some others. All of that represents only a small part of the total, unfortunately, at this stage. On that graph, let's note that at this stage we don't even see hydrogen, just because it is not a primary source of energy. We'll come back to that in a moment. So as we know, the problem with fossil fuels is that they generate CO2 emissions, which in turn create climate change. Here on that page, maybe a table that you've seen according to GIEC. So we are facing already critical issues with if we are heading towards plus 1.5 degrees. And even more critical issues if the current trajectory is actually taking us towards +2, +3, or even more. So the question is, what if we don't want that? What should we do if we don't want that? Let's take a look at the main contributors of CO2 emissions here at global levels. They are actually made from some key sectors: electricity and heat production, agriculture, which includes fertilizers, manufacturing, which includes here steel manufacturing, construction, and mobility as the key big blocks in terms of CO2 emissions generations. So today we are here to answer the question at the below: where can hydrogen help decarbonize the picture? To answer that question, there are actually two dimensions that I'd like to introduce. The first one is production, and the second one is actually made of the different applications that could be relevant for hydrogen. Let's start with production. At the moment, on the left part of that page, more than 95% of the hydrogen that is produced is actually generated from fossil fuel, from gas, through a process that is called steam methane reformer. It's a process that generates a lot of CO2. So 11 tons of CO2 for 1 ton of hydrogen produced. In other words, it's a process that generates 10 times more CO2 than hydrogen. That's the current situation. The idea when we talk about green hydrogen is to be more on the right side of that page with production of hydrogen that is from water electrolysis using low carbon electricity. So typically nuclear, hydraulic, wind, and solar photovoltaic. And even with this approach, it's not totally green. There is still a carbon footprint between 0.2 and 2.6 tons of CO2 for 1 ton of hydrogen produced. But the idea is there. Second dimension, the applications. I'd like to talk about 3 main ones as illustrative examples where green hydrogen, if I may say green, is relevant. One is mobility. The second one is the production of ammonia, for example, for fertilizers. And the third one is about steel manufacturing. So mobility first. Mobility first. It's actually quite relevant to try to decarbonize mobility. If we look at a country like France, which is represented on this page, transportation and mobility in general has become the main biggest contributor to CO2 emissions. And therefore, it's quite relevant to set a target for decarbonizing mobility. Can hydrogen do that? That's one of the questions. If we look at a scenario from International Energy Agency, we can see on that page that if we consider cars, but also heavy mobility, meaning the vans, the trucks, the buses, the trains, if we look at all the types of mobility, the growth rates that we should be seeing are very high. By 2025, they should be between 50 and 100% per year. So that's a very, very strong growth. And between 2025 and 2030, the growth rates should be around 30–50% per year, which should continue to be very high. One of the limits or questions, however, might be in terms of unit vehicles. If we look at, for example, in 10 years' time, we are here based on that scenario from International Energy Agency, talking about 2 million vehicles, where, as a comparison, we already have today, every year, those are annual numbers, every year 80 million unit vehicles, let's say traditional vehicles. So hydrogen, in terms of, on one side, there should be a very strong growth. On the other side, in terms of how much it can penetrate the mobility system, there's a question whether it will be, let's say, a mainstream phenomenon or some kind of niche positioning around heavy mobility, some specific cars and things like that. So in my opinion, in my humble opinion, there's a question. There's not a question on the growth. There will be growth, but there's a question on the amplitude of the substitution, and therefore the underlying strategies for all the players involved in that trend.
Yeah.
Second application, where hydrogen, and more particularly green hydrogen, could be relevant, is the production of ammonia. If we are able to produce low carbon hydrogen, we should be able to produce low carbon ammonia. And ammonia could have several applications. The first one here on the left is regarding fertilizers. Today, 64% of the use of ammonia is actually orientated towards nitrogen-based fertilizers. If we look at here the breakdown of what are the applications in the recent years of ammonia, 77% are related to fertilizers, and within that, or 64% of the whole corresponds to nitrogen-based fertilizers. So here, we have one potential application where we could substitute fossil fuel-based fertilizers, because they are made out of gas initially. We can substitute that towards more low-carbon fertilizers thanks to low-carbon hydrogen. Another application could be here on the right at the bottom, shipping fuel for the shipping industry. Third and final application that I would like to talk about is the, if we can call it this way, low carbon manufacturing of steel. At the moment, on the left part of this graph, the production of steel is actually one of the main contributors to CO2 emissions. We've seen in the graph before the big share of industry in which steel lies. So here the idea on the right-hand side of the page is to use green or low-carbon hydrogen to reduce iron ore in order to produce steel, and this is actually the principle for a few pilot phases manufacturing plants that we start seeing, for example, in Europe, with Spain, with Italy, driven by players like ArcelorMittal.
Which, by the way, if I may, Julien, for Estin Co, we talked about that in one of our webinars lately, specifically the decarbonization of a steel factory from ArcelorMittal in Italy.
Yeah, absolutely. So once we've said that, how could we put into perspective what to think about hydrogen? In my humble position, I would summarize it this way. So there is definitely a potential role to be played by hydrogen when targeting the objective of decarbonizing economies. There's a potential for low carbon hydrogen production, mainly from the use of low carbon electricity, nuclear power, hydropower, wind and solar photovoltaic sources of electricity. That's on the side of production. On the side of applications, there's a need to discriminate what are the most relevant applications for hydrogen. Mobility might be one of them, in my opinion, with a few question marks, whether it's mobility as a whole or just mobility. So is it a niche question or a mainstream substitution? I'm not sure it can be mainstream, but that's personal. And beyond mobility, there are other applications which I introduced very briefly. Ammonia for fertilizers and steel production within the industry. I'd like to mention that for those two applications, what I think is interesting is that hydrogen and low carbon hydrogen might actually be one or maybe the only way that we may have to decarbonize those fields of activities. If we don't use hydrogen there, I personally don't see yet how we could decarbonize those industries. So here there's in my opinion, an opportunity that is clearly relevant for hydrogen. And when all under the relevant conditions for players investing in hydrogen, there should be strong growth perspective, more than 10% per year growth over the next 5 or 10 years, maybe beyond. But there's growth potential as long as everything else in terms of production and in terms of application is precised a bit more specifically. Finally, the comment I'd like to make is that hydrogen might probably be only one potential element in a more complex equation that is still to be found to decarbonize the economies. The other elements being around what we could call sobriety, low carbon energy, nuclear, hydro, wind, and solar, and low carbon usages in mobility, agriculture, construction and housing, as well as industry. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't go either too slowly or too quickly, but I'm happy to go back to any slides and answer or start a discussion around those topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julien. It was a very clear and crisp presentation of the potential of hydrogen. It's very interesting to bucket things this way, to give people the visibility on what this is about. Do you have any questions for Julien? As I know that it's a very controversial topic from time depending on the audience. Yeah, sure. Please just jump in.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Julien, for the presentation. It was very clear and vulgarized. So thank you for making it as clear as you did. If we go back to the example of the car that you presented, and maybe we can deep dive on the slide even further. How does the growth, because you mentioned an important growth in the hydrogen cars by 2030, how does that compare to the overall growth of cars consumption? And this looks quite promising. So is it a good thing? Is it a realistic thing? And does it have a big impact on the decarbonization and carbon emissions?
So here I'm back on the page where I showed some numbers that are actually developed by the International Energy Agency. So the numbers here are in 1,000 units of personal cars or heavy mobility transportation means like vans, trucks, buses, and trains. It starts from a very limited base today. And then it goes towards, let's say, a couple of million units globally in the next 10 years. So they should be here. The CAGRs are very high because it starts from a limited point. If we take 2025 as a more established or the actual initial platform where there will be a more significant starting base. Based on the scenario from IEA, we should see 30% per year growth between 2025 and 2030. This is really much higher than what we can be expecting in the let's say in the automotive or heavy mobility transportation market, where it clearly will be only one single digit growth. So there will be growth. The question and the limits I can only emphasize is that how deep can be the substitution? There might be controversial vision, but even if we look at here the numbers that are from IEA, it looks like we are talking about a substitution of a few percent compared to the more traditional transportation means. Therefore, there might be a limitation on how, at global level, and given the ambition that we need to have in terms of CO2 emissions, that might be limited.
And what's the limiting factor? Is it the price to produce or something else?
Well, in my opinion, there might be a couple of reasons. The first one is about I would say the energy efficiency and energy yield of hydrogen system within a car. If you start from the very beginning, because you need to produce the hydrogen, as we talked about, if you look at it, I can actually have one additional slide for that. For a fuel cell here, the energy yield is much lower if we compare to a traditional electric vehicle. It's much lower, and therefore, if you put it in a simple way, why bother with a hydrogen car if for a similar size electric car, traditional electric car would be more efficient? That's one point. The second point, in my opinion, is about I would say the infrastructure and the storage distribution infrastructure for hydrogen, which is it's a gas, not so easy to handle, and therefore, in terms of how is it feasible to actually develop a large-scale distribution system to make sure that anyone can access hydrogen in an easy way is not obvious at all. So I would personally say that those two things might be a hurdle for mainstream development and substitution towards hydrogen cars.
That may explain why, when you look at the projections about electric car sales, they should represent, according from different studies, half of the sales of new cars in about 10 years' time. So it's a huge impact on mobility versus hydrogen.
So I hope it answered a little bit of your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Hello, this is Hugo speaking. Thanks for the interesting presentation. If possible, I'd like to have a brief explanation of the cost differences between traditional production of steel and the cars and so on and so forth. You know, how the cost will be different to use the hydrogen in general. And then what is the strategy to absorb the higher cost if the cost is higher? People are now, scared about the inflation. So if the cost is high, the adoption of the hydrogen, production is, significantly challenged. So that's why I'm asking this question in terms of cost differences between the traditional methodology and the new methodology using hydrogen.
Well, that's obviously a very good question. It's difficult to answer in a generic way, and it has to be on a case by case in terms of application of hydrogen. In the particular case that we just mentioned for cars, it is likely that there would be higher costs. However, it's not impossible to think that in other applications you could actually bring a better cost efficiency thanks to low carbon hydrogen. And I'd like to show one potential example of that by coming back to my example in fertilizer. So for fertilizer, here, if we look at ammonia, which is the initial part, or let's say the precursor of a lot of nitrogen-based fertilizers, the price of ammonia, because it comes from gas, has been cyclical over the past decades, with strong spikes when gas prices are high, which is, as we unfortunately know, the case at the moment where ammonia is very high. In that particular case, at that particular moment, producing low carbon hydrogen, for example, based on low carbon electricity, might be an opportunity to make the price of ammonia and fertilizers cheaper. So sorry for the complex question. There's not one fits all answer to that question. The question is absolutely critical, but it has to be analyzed on case by case approach.
Thank you. I think it's a really interesting, realistic approach, looking at the component of the price, something goes higher and lower, so that's always so. If you go to the higher price, material, then you can have a more opportunity to get into the market, and that makes sense. So thank you.
Olivier, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just asking if there was more questions for Julien.
Yeah, I've got one. First, Julien, thank you very much for the presentation. It was I've read a lot of things on hydrogen, and I'm not an expert, but I think it's very interesting to see, the link between the various implication and the projection as well on what's going on. It appears that it's a subject which is interesting me since 2006, and I remember, you were maybe not even born, in 2006, there have been at the European Commission, at the DG Environment, there have been a paper, I don't remember, I have to find back when it was and what it was, but there was a kind of news alert, they were doing. And there was some British scientists who were puzzled and questioning, in fact, the benefit of hydrogen, and saying that it could be, especially the leakage. They were talking about the leakage. So I guess that since 2006, some positive evolution have changed their mind. But that was, I've always read things that hydrogen is a good element if you want to move from a fossil-based energy to a less, I would say, impacting energy. But the question I wanted to ask, don't you think that with the willingness of doing something somewhere in a hurry, especially from a political point of view where people need to show, and some corporates as well, to do something, we're not going without paying attention and taking time on analyzing what are all the impacts from one problem to another, which means that, in fact, a less impacted problem, but a problem which will not solve the issue somewhere. Sorry if my question is not very clear, but
I think I understand it. I think I would agree. I think we are all human beings. We are facing a very big challenge, and we might have the tendency or the weakness to think that we will find some kind of magic wand to solve the problem. And as soon as we might have hope in something, I don't know, our brain is likely to say, "Oh, we found the solution, and it's one magical solution." Unfortunately, it's not that easy. It would be too good to be true. It's not particularly the problem of hydrogen. We can see that in plenty of other, I would say, technologies, including, if I may, some renewables questions, or any solution if we consider one solution as such. We always have the tendency to believe it will be the only one and the magical solution. That's why I ended up my presentation saying that might be a good idea to have hydrogen, might be a good idea to have plenty of other things, but it's not a one easy answer. It's a more complex equation where we must not forget everything else that is not to do, that it doesn't have anything to do with hydrogen, and is absolutely critical to find the solution or a part of the solution. But I agree. Sometimes human beings have the tendency to believe that only one thing is the magical solution to everything, which is obviously delusional.
And if you look, if I may add something, Julien, to Philippe's point, is that if you look at the numbers from the beginning of the presentation, the total investment expected to go to net zero in 2050, and the investment we need from here to 2030 to go net zero in 2050 is $6 trillion. And hydrogen is 1.2 trillion, so about 20% of the total investment, when it's going to only deliver 10% of the CO2 emission saving at best. And so that shows how hard it is and how diverse the solution is going to be from my perspective also.
Yeah.
Hi, Julien. I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. We've been reading about the fact that green hydrogen is still not efficient in terms of cost to produce. Have you studied also white hydrogen and looked into it? Which is obviously a natural hydrogen, for those who don't know.
Honestly, I haven't worked in details white hydrogen. I couldn't elaborate on that. However, if I go back a little bit at the beginning of your question about the manufacturing cost of hydrogen and green hydrogen, I would agree that there might be questions when we deal with new energy renewables for production of hydrogen. But honestly, if we consider dedicated nuclear power plants, that could be quite competitive, even if other topics needs to be managed in that particular case.
Julien, there is more questions in the chat. Yeah, I don't know if you have access to it, or I'm happy to read them otherwise. There is one question from Charlie Bivan. What do you consider the main policy barriers, if there are any, to further investment in the hydrogen solutions in Europe?
Well, so as I'm going to elaborate my answer to the following reasoning. If we say that low carbon energy is needed to produce competitive low carbon hydrogen, one need to consider nuclear as one of the potential sources of power. And in my opinion, the position of Europe on that matter has been not clear enough, stop and go, and therefore not helping in hydrogen about the production of low carbon hydrogen. And so I think that's one of the main policy barriers. Maybe we are at the moment where there is an inflection. We'll see. Maybe, maybe not. That's my answer to that question at the moment.
Thank you. One more question I see from Gurdip. I see you you're on video too, Gurdip. If you want to ask your question directly, happy to, or can read it. Why? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to know what the assumptions were behind your energy consumption numbers for green hydrogen. You had solar quite high compared to that of nuclear and wind in terms of the energy consumption.
All right.
And given you just mentioned nuclear a couple of times on 2 previous questions, there's a lot of emissions in creating the nuclear power plant in construction. So is that taken into consideration or not? Because that would jump the number up higher, I would assume, and that's not from a knowledge, it's just an assumption I'm making myself.
So here I'm using some data from the French agency called ADEME. I believe they've done things properly. They've taken account the whole life cycle for all energy sources, and because production of solar panels is at the moment produced in large quantities in China, where electricity is mainly based in coal. That's the reason why the number is higher for that particular applications. It's still lower than gas, though. If you compare to the 95% footprint of hydrogen being produced by methane reforming, but it's a bit higher than the rest.
Thank you.
Julien, one more question for you in the chat, if you have time for that. What are the perspectives of implementation of hydrogen in Africa, especially in Morocco, where renewable energy projects has reached a high level of maturity and can be helpful for the development of green hydrogen production?
I've been seeing some projects of production of low carbon hydrogen in Africa based on renewables. It's probably a case-by-case approach. I'm still a bit hesitating when looking at renewables. There is the question of intermittent production, and when you look at the whole process of producing hydrogen and maybe after hydrogen ammonia, it's better to have something a bit more steady. Therefore, there might be limitation in that particular case. However, I would say why not? This has to be analyzed. I've seen several projects being developed in that sense. There are questions, fundamental questions, but to be analyzed on a case by case.
Thank you very much. We're just over the 50 minutes timeline that we were trying to take. We can maybe, if there's any more question, we can take a last one, I believe. Otherwise, we leave it there for today. Thank you very much, Julien, for this very clear presentation and all the questions it created, because I think the hydrogen is a fascinating topic, And you know, for those who are this presentation has been recorded, but it's yet to be if we can publish it. But if you reach out to us, if you have more questions, of course, we'll be happy to answer them. And if you want to support us and become a member of Green Adabai, you can just go to our website for that. It's a very simple process. Thank you, everybody. Have a very great day or end of day for the Asian part of our community. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.